good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are around the globe, and welcome to Arcview Access and our special edition today focusing on China and the future of CBD. So as many of you may or may not know, Arcview is celebrating its 10-year anniversary this year, which, by the way, for those of you who are married, may know also that it's traditionally celebrated with aluminum. And the reason for aluminum is that this metal is durable, flexible, and the foundation for a long-term sustainable union. By the way, China is the top producer of aluminum. Over this past 10 years, Arcview has been and will continue to be the nexus for investors, companies, and the canna-curious in the cannabis and hemp space. And this is no more true than today with the emergence of hemp CBD in China. Our goal today is to share insights into this soon-to-be explosive market and how hemp could bring the world together in a way that no other plant, product, or process has ever done in our history. It's our pleasure to be co-producing this event with Azer Horizon, who is the first U.S. company to secure a license to process CBD from hemp in China, and they are focused on Asia's emerging hemp-derived cannabinoid industry. With an initial focus in China, they are developing a large-scale EU GMP-certified processing and production facility to provide low-cost cannabinoids for the global pharmaceutical supply chain and the emerging Chinese domestic market. They are also beginning to distribute Western-branded cannabinoid consumer products in China, and Azer Horizon aims to create positive change, advancing this new frontier in the development of the global hemp industry. My co-host today is no stranger to Arcview, and it's my honor to introduce you to John Downs. John is the founder, shareholder, and executive vice president for Azer Horizons and is based in Los Angeles. Actually, I'm going to rephrase that. He's a co-founder in Azer Horizons, and he's based in Los Angeles. He was previously the director of business development right here at the Arcview Group, where he oversaw business and corporate development, including revamping the structure of Arcview's forums, spearheading our bridge and Series A financings, and the initiation of Arcview Capital. He's been an investor, an advisor, and focused on emerging markets and global security since 2008, when he joined a boutique broker-dealer and participated in dozens of corporate finance transactions. So to steal a line from Sheng, let's focus on what we can accomplish together, and more than ever, we need to resist the forces that are creating divisions globally, and let's create this strong union. John, please join me and let's get this show started.
Thank you so much, Kim. I appreciate that very kind introduction and the promotion. I'm a co-founder now, so actually I should say I'm a founding shareholder of Azer.
Founding shareholder. Okay, I knew I was going to mess that up a little, but thanks for correcting that for me.
as well as an executive vice president. And so I've been here since the very beginning with Brian. Of course, our backgrounds, having been at Arcview, I saw Brian develop this thesis first as a partner at Arcview Capital, as an investor looking at the Asian hemp industry and opportunities for investment, and then ultimately as an operator, as the founder and CEO of Azer Horizon. And so it's been a real thrill for me to be along for that ride and to participate in our progress to date. It's also been a thrill to collaborate with Arcview Market Research. We appreciate the opportunity for Arcview Market Research to publish this research report that we've put so much time and energy into. I want to send a special thanks to the author. Of course, it was a team effort. We all worked very hard on it, but I think I'd be remiss if I didn't mention all the hard work of Nicole Bugnacki, our associate, who really was integral in pulling together this 40-plus page report that gives an overview and hopes to answer the question of the webinar that the webinar is asking today, which is China the future of CBD? And I would say if China is not the future, it's certainly a force to be reckoned with, both internationally, where China's structural cost advantages lend itself to low-cost API production, but also, and I think most importantly, domestically, where China's 1.4 billion consumers are only now beginning to really understand and become aware of the benefits that CBD may provide. And so, the story of hemp and cannabis legalization is starting from a couple of states in the Western U.S. and extending out across North America, South America, Europe, Africa, and now, of course, Asia has begun to regulate and organize a hemp industry. And so any discussion of hemp and cannabis in Asia, I think, must begin with China. And that's going to be the primary point of our conversation today. And to help guide that conversation, I want to bring in our moderator, who we're so thrilled to have join us, Vivien Azer. She's the managing director and senior research analyst specializing in beverages, tobacco, and of course, the cannabis sectors for Cowen. Vivien's no stranger to any of us, I'm sure, but she's the first Wall Street analyst to cover the emerging cannabis sector, which brought her much gratitude from those of us within the industry as she brought that credibility, but also has seen her featured in notable press coverage from CNBC to the Wall Street Journal, Barron's, and Forbes. And so along with her colleague, Gerald Pascarelli, who will also join, they're a formidable tandem of analysts covering the cannabis industry for the benefit of investors. And so the accolades have certainly piled up for her. She's got a spot on the Institutional Investors All-America Research Team more than once. She's one of MJ Biz Daily's list of 20 women to watch in 2019 and is also selected by Business Insider as a rising star of marijuana investing. So she's been at the forefront of covering the Canadian and U.S. cannabis and hemp industries. We're very grateful to Vivien for joining us today and to lead the conversation about the emerging Chinese cannabinoid industry. And so the structure of the webinar today is Vivien and Gerald are going to initially have an interview with Brian Sheng, the CEO and founder of Asia Horizon, to discuss the key findings of the report that we just published last night, and I'm sure many of you have already received in your inbox. And then we'll open it up to a broader panel where we'll be joined by other experts in the international business, hemp, and cannabis community to discuss the implications of China being a force in the global CBD market. And so without further ado, I want to welcome my friend Vivien Azer. Thank you.
Thank you.
John and Kim, thank you so much. It's so good to be with you guys today, discussing this very exciting research. As John mentioned, I'm Vivien Azer, Managing Director at Cowen, covering beverages, tobacco, and most notably cannabis as it relates to our discussion today. I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague, Gerald Pascarelli. As John noted, Gerald has been a partner of mine at Cowen for more than 6 years now. We both joined the firm in 2014. He's a vice president and also covers beverages and cannabis. Gerald is an emerging analyst with a focus on CBD and extraction, and very excited that he's launched on 3 companies under his own coverage this year as well. In addition, we're joined by Brian Sheng, and we're so excited to talk about your research today, Brian. So thanks for being with us. A couple of points on Brian. He's a businessman and an investor. He's the founder and CEO of Asia Horizons, which is a private equity investment and an operating company focused on the emerging hemp-derived cannabinoid industry in Asia. Brian is also the general partner at the Arcview Group, and he is a board member of 4Es. Brian, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Vivien.
So, Brian, John's introductory remarks, I think, were really helpful in terms of setting the stage for this conversation today. And he noted both the domestic opportunity as well as the international one. And something that you and Gerald and I have already talked about, but I think it'll be really helpful for the audience. Can we just start by level setting what the global regulatory environment looks like for hemp-derived CBD?
Sure. So I think in many ways, the global regulation for CBD are actually quite similar. So we'll start with the United States, where right now CBD is hemp is federally legal, but the clarity of CBD being used as an ingredient in food and supplements is currently, there's not much guidance, and the FDA is still currently under review, and we're looking for more guidance on that over the next year 18 months. In the EU, there has been a lot of movements lately where it's likely that CBD may go down the route of narcotics control, and that there previously been talks of application as a novel food ingredient. And then moving towards China, where CBD today is actually allowed as an ingredient in topical and beauty products, but is not allowed to be ingested, which is similar to the rest of the world. But today, hemp is being regulated in China in a few provinces to be allowed for cultivation and extraction, and something that is very new that has occurred in just the last few years.
It's really helpful. Gerald, I think we wanted to move to some China-specific regulatory questions, and I'll turn it to you.
We did. Thanks, Vivien. Hi, Brian. And so just, I guess, to follow up on that, it's still obviously early days when it comes to CBD in China. Can you point to any upcoming catalysts, either over the duration of this year or maybe next year, that are on the horizon for China, just to provide some base level context?
Sure. I think one of the biggest catalysts that are on the horizon is not at the China level, but on the international level. So in December of this year, the CND, Commission on Narcotic Drugs, which is the central drug policy body for the United Nations, is set to vote on recommendations made by the World Health Organization to make changes to how they're classifying cannabis and cannabis derivatives. And why that's a catalyst is there's a potential for two changes that are very impactful. One of which is recognizing the medical value of cannabis and thus perhaps rescheduling cannabis from its current designation on the list of scheduled narcotics. And the second is that there is a chance that CBD, or what's actually said as an extract that is made predominantly from CBD and less than 0.2% THC, may not be under international control. So what that will allow is, if the vote goes through, then it essentially opens up a regulatory green light for member nations to go ahead and open up regulation for allowing CBD in their jurisdictions. And in China specifically, this is actually something that the Chinese DEA and Chinese regulatory bodies are citing as something that is very important for moving the CBD industry forward.
Got it. That's super helpful context. I guess, like, as we think about the scale that China could ultimately have in CBD, how important is globalization, in particular progress made in the West, in terms of acting as a catalyst for scale within China?
I think from the regulatory perspective, it is very important. So if you look at the trend of legalization, it's quite obvious where we are today that Asia is just starting to legalize. We've heard about legalization in places like Thailand and South Korea, although those are about medical cannabis and not hemp. And China is really about hemp and non-psychoactive, non-THC related. But it's very much that regulatory movements in the West, either at the UN level or in the United States, is driving some of the adoption and more liberalization that's happening in Asia. So I would definitely say that from the regulatory perspective, that Asian countries are definitely looking towards the West. And which goes along with that is, as we've seen now, the biggest catalyst for market expansion globally for the industry is simply legalization. So as the regulatory parts move, then it will really start to kick off the full potential of CBD consumer market in China and the scale of the market itself.
Just to follow up on that, Brian, given that it seems like it is quite early days in China, it seems like you guys are pretty well positioned, as an early mover in the marketplace. Can you expand on what the competitive landscape looks like today? Thanks.
Sure. So the competitive landscape, I would focus on a few parts of it. So the way I would focus on is looking at cultivation, processing, and then the consumer market, so meaning consumer brands. In the entirety of China, there's about a dozen companies that are licensed for CBD extraction, which is the most specific or the most controlled part of the supply chain. Because cultivation of hemp has been around in China for many, many years, most recently with legal actual framework being implemented in Yunnan province back in 2009. So at least a decade of full regulatory exposure on the cultivation side. So on the cultivation side, there's a number of players that are non-cannabinoid producing, so meaning industrial grain varieties of hemp cultivators that have been around. But there's only about a dozen companies, and the reason I say about is because there's no public registrar of the full number of license holders. But based on our research, we have found about a dozen companies that are in that. And the background of these types of companies are usually large publicly traded pharmaceutical type companies or companies that have a strong connection to the local government or tied in very strongly with the local economy. So, and the rationale for that is quite simple, is that while China is starting to open up the CBD industry, it is still very much being considered a controlled substance. And so the government is very cautiously opening it up and looking for companies that have actually the capabilities to move it forward in a very controlled fashion. And over the past 18 months, I would say that we're now seeing the emergence of many CBD beauty and cosmetic type companies, again, because of the fact that this is a completely legal part of the Chinese market for on a national level actually. And so we're seeing a lot of movements on the consumer front recently as well.
And given the nature of the offering and its designation as a controlled substance, can you talk a little bit more around what licensing protocols look like and kind of what barriers to entry exist in the market? Thanks.
Sure. So the biggest part, so the licensing process, it depends on the jurisdiction. So currently, again, to reiterate, currently there are 2 provinces in China, Heilongjiang province and Yunnan province, that have opened up a regulatory framework for cultivation and extraction. And at the core of it, it has to do with a drug control or narcotics control. So 2 of the most critical parts of getting a process license really convincing the government that you have the capabilities to control and trace every part of your operation, including controlling where your THC that gets split out from the hemp plant, how that's controlled, how that's siloed, and how that is being destroyed, so that it does not flow into the normal market. So it really focuses on the company's ability to have full operational control over the controlled substance.
That's really helpful. And one last one for me before I turn it back to Gerald. But what are kind of the next steps in terms of the other provinces following? Because it's only 2 provinces now. There are many more in China. So what do you need to see broader adoption of a more accommodative regulatory framework at the provincial level?
Sure. I honestly don't think that, and this is drawing off of interviews we had with government officials at the Narcotics Bureau, at the Police Bureau, and the viewpoint is that the Chinese government would rather deal with a lesser number of very strong operational companies that have going back to the capabilities to control the industry, viewing it as a controlled substance. So the viewpoint is not really trying to have a framework like Colorado or California, where many different players are able to gain a license. So when I think about that, other provinces are looking at it, but from the perspective perhaps more cultivation for grain and industrial varieties of hemp, or perhaps focusing on downstream manufacturing of CBD, for example, so CBD cosmetics in regions that are powerhouses for cosmetics contract manufacturing. I think how it will work in China is that there will be an opening up of consumer categories where it is way less controlled. So, for example, more CBD cosmetics, topicals in the future, perhaps more CBD supplements and all types of consumer products. But my viewpoint is that the supply side in producing cannabinoids will not be an area that will be open very widely, similar to a framework that we might understand in California or Colorado.
That's helpful. Thank you.
That's super helpful context. Brian, I think it would be helpful if you maybe touch on China's core competencies as it relates to industrial hemp versus, the need to go to hemp as a finished consumer good. I guess, how do you see that relationship evolving over the near term?
Yeah, so China has traditionally always, over the past 50 years, focused on industrial varieties of hemp for fiber, for grain, and et cetera. China has a quasi-state academic institution called the Institute of Hemp Research, which has been studying the plant nonstop for the better part of the past half a century. So, China has very strong strength when it comes to industrial hemp research. Now, on the consumer cannabinoid side, that is something much newer. That is something over the past 2-3 years that started flowing in from the United States, from Canada, et cetera. And so I think given that there is a recognition that this is an emerging opportunity, many more market participants and also various stakeholders in the industry is trying to understand how this is going to develop, looking at what happened in the West. So, again, alluding to cosmetics categories, food categories, I think these are the things that people are most interested in and most excited about, is as regulation loosen up, the emergence of these CPG categories and perhaps therapeutic pharmaceutical pathways and opening up that entire market in China.
Got it. And it just sounds like, based on your previous commentary, that China is going to be very prudent in terms of issuing these production and extraction licenses, being mindful of supply. I was just curious if the Western world, the U.S. in particular, what we've seen in the hemp supply is ultimately going to have any credence in informing the lawmakers' decisions in China to not roll out the products, or is that something that's I guess separate to what we've seen in the U.S., where there is an abundance of supply and certainly it is resulting in massive price deflation and pressure at the lower levels of the supply chain?
Yeah, so I think there's two parts to that. So I don't think in that way, the Chinese regulations surrounding how licenses are given out will be influenced by Western regulation. More specifically, actually, in fact, despite now the liberalization of more CBD type products in production, I don't see a pathway at all in the near future for THC of any kind to be allowed in China. I don't see that as a possibility, no matter whether THC gets rescheduled at the international level, federally illegal in the US or not. I just simply don't think that's a pathway for China, given the history as well as the direction for the development in China. So I really think the development here is really talking about opening up, looking at CBD again as a CPG category, as a CPG ingredient to be used in any number of sectors that we're used to, and that's really the opportunity as consumers, addressing addressing anxiety, addressing pain, the different conditions that we know are that CBD and different types of CBD products are effective for. That is something that the Chinese consumer is being exposed to for the first time, especially given the case that Chinese consumers will not be able to experience medical cannabis or recreational cannabis at all. So it's almost that the CBD products is as a lesser form and legal and non-psychoactive form of that.
I just love to follow up. I'm so glad we're pivoting to the consumer, because this is what Gerald and I kind of live, eat, and breathe is consumer demand, innovation, and, for traditional categories that we cover, marketing. So I'd love to understand what the Chinese consumers' awareness is around CBD and how you drive that. Is it influencer marketing? Is it, e-commerce? Help us understand what that landscape looks like, please.
Sure. Yeah. So awareness is just starting to increase. So, over there again, looking at we track CFDA data, Chinese FDA data to look at registration for CBD related products, and we've seen a significant uptick over the starting from about starting from about end of 2018. So basically over the past 18 months. And some of the catalysts that we're seeing this year is very much focused on e-commerce and on what we call KOL marketing, so live streaming. So part of what we're seeing is that, and this is something I guess to inform our audience a little bit, is that the nature of e-commerce and the intensity of e-commerce in China is completely unparalleled compared to what we might expect in the United States. In fact, consumer behavior in China and the penetration of e-commerce and the digitalization of consumer behavior actually helps inform the rest of the world right now on how we might think about moving forward after coronavirus, how people will interact with retail purchasing versus online purchasing. To give an example, I was looking at L'Oreal's recent Q2 earning calls, and what I noticed was that China was their biggest growth segment. China was the only segment that had double-digit growth, while the entire world's growth was in the negative digits expectedly, and that e-commerce grew 58% over the last quarter. And to give an example of a live streamer or a KOL, there's this one guy known as the king of lipsticks in China who in one day, the Chinese equivalent of Black Friday, in one day he was able to sell about a quarter of Estee Lauder's entire annual revenue of 2019. So this guy in one day sold 145 million US dollars worth of products, and Estee Lauder in an entire year sold about 575 million dollars. So that's what the consumer market looked like. And some of these KOLs, actually the same guy that we're talking about here, they're looking for CBD products. They're aware of the category. So I think that's really going to drive very rapid, awareness growth as more of these live streamers are starting to pick up the category.
That's fascinating. I mean, it's an entirely unique proposition to the Chinese market. When you first told me about these live streamers, it really couldn't even wrap my head around, what that was as a proposition. But clearly, it's a very effective marketing tool. When you think about the category opportunity by form factor, you've mentioned kind of topicals, which I think you're defining more as maybe targeted pain relief versus like beauty and skincare. So I would, perhaps distinguish between those. Where do you think the biggest opportunity lies?
Yeah. So, obviously, I think that one of the biggest opportunity would be in ingestibles, just like in the United States. But I think where an area might differ is the how much more popular, how much more of an opportunity the beauty sector for CBD products is in China, which we know in the United States is it sells while it's still a popular product, but it does not compare to ingestible products. And I think that really just ties in with the fact that how big. Well, APAC represents the largest beauty market in the world, and China has surpassed the United States as the largest beauty market 2 years ago. And I think that trend and the sophistication and the sophistication of Chinese beauty consumers, their willingness to try a new product in the CBD category will lead to a very, very differentiated opportunity set for this particular segment of the market. I think there will also be very interesting localized product formats that we're not used to in the United States. For example, when we talk about topicals, I think there could be mixtures between traditional Chinese medicine and CBD that appears in the future that form factors we simply haven't seen yet. But I think those could be interesting localized product formats in the future.
That's fascinating. I'll ask one last one before we move on to the panel, which you'll join me for, Brian. In a prior life, I was an associate covering home and personal care products, including Estee Lauder. And I think for the benefit of the audience, I think it's really important to understand some of the nuances that you're describing in terms of juxtaposing the U.S. beauty market versus the Asian beauty market and why the Asian beauty market is so large. And it's my impression, having covered Estee and the global beauty market is that the Asian consumer is a multi-step. It's a regimented skincare protocol that women go through. And like in markets like South Korea, it's like 7 or 8 steps in the morning and at night. So it seems to me that there surely would be a fair amount of opportunity for that proposition. So then with that in mind, as you kind of think about the market developing in terms of, beauty as one offering, until ingestibles are permissible, where do you think you're going to see movers of scale? Are you expecting that an Estee Lauder is going to introduce this into the market? Is it going to be private smaller players that are going to use more of a grassroots kind of KOL activation? How are you thinking about that evolving?
Yeah, so I think we are already seeing both. So we are already seeing CBD products being introduced to the market by smaller players. Aspiring entrepreneurs who are creating, cosmetics brands for China. And we're also seeing larger brands, public companies, start to create their own portfolio of CBD products because I think it's not too large of a jump for companies to see that this is a new ingredient that have caught on in the West and that there is an opportunity here to create a new segment around this product. So what we're seeing in the market, again, while this is early, but we have actually in the past 6 months, we have seen a significant uptick in entrance to the in creating new portfolio products. So I think we don't have to guess here. It is starting to happen already, and I think that will only become more pervasive as regulations become more clear. If in December regulations around CBD at the UN level gets cleared up, I think we're right before an inflection point for which China will open up its market, much more over the next few years.
Perfect. Well, I think that is a terrific way to conclude this panel and pivot to the next. So, Gerald, my sincere thanks to you for co-moderating this with me.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for having me.
Absolutely. And if I could ask Geoff and Ron and Jennifer to please join us for our next segment. This is going to be a 40-minute discussion. I'm joined by Geoff Whaling from Collective Growth Corp, Ron Wardle from I.Media, and Jennifer Lee, of course, from Deloitte, who has been a thought leader in the industry as well. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to the three of you. Thank you for joining us.
Great to see you, Vivien.
Thank you very much for having us.
Yep, thanks for having me.
So I've got some pretty fulsome bios here, and rather than just reading off of my iPhone, why don't I ask each of my panelists to introduce themselves briefly? Jennifer, I'll start with you.
Sure. Thanks, Vivien. So Jennifer Lee, I'm a global managing partner for Deloitte. I actually started the cannabis practice at Deloitte because of our Canadian jurisdiction. And I work globally with both consumer products companies, retailers, and specifically in the consumer, really understanding the retail space. Some notable work that we've done is we've worked with Japan Tobacco, Nestle, but also I stood up the Alberta cannabis and the BC cannabis market on behalf of the government. So really understand the Canadian market, doing a lot of work right now in the US as they try to understand, corporates try and understand the CBD market. So happy to share any insights.
That's terrific. Thank you, Jennifer. And Geoff, I'll turn it to you, please.
Well, thanks very much, Vivien. Geoff Whaling, I am happy to be here from our farm in Pennsylvania. But I, like Jennifer, I am a Canadian, but an American citizen. I worked with the Mulroney administration back in the 80s that first introduced hemp to our landscape in Canada. When I came to the United States, we are surrounded by 400 acres here. I wondered why we didn't grow hemp in America. And so I went off on that path. Volunteered for 5.5 years to create the Pennsylvania Hemp Industry Council, helped a number of states as the 2014 Farm Bill came into effect. And then I was asked if I would join the National Hemp Association. And I have proudly been the chairman of that organization for the last 3 years. We work across the board. I believe that we are the largest hemp advocacy group, nonpartisan group in the country. Once the bill passed, I was approached by my colleagues and friends at Canopy Growth to see if I would help them come and help bring their brand into the United States. So I joined Bruce and Mark to do so when Bruce was fired, and he would want me to make sure that everyone knows he was fired from Canopy, that he was a real champion for the hemp and industrial hemp space and CBD. And when it was permissible for he and I to do so, we came back together and decided that during COVID-19, we would launch Collective Growth, which today is the largest fund publicly traded on NASDAQ. I think we've got about $154 million in the bank right now that we are using to help build the domestic supply chain here in America.
Terrific. Thanks for that, Geoff. And last but not least, Ron, thanks for joining us.
Vivien, thank you very much. And I'm very pleasure to be joining the established and very prominent group you guys have here today. For myself, I've been in Asia over 30 years. I've been in Shanghai since 2005 up until now. So it's a little over 15 years. So started and ran a digital agency and have been in the very depth of Alibaba and JD and the China e-commerce landscape for over a little over 10 years now. I recently left and ran the largest, what we call the TP or Taobao partner agency in China that allowed e-commerce and social media and digital aspects of stuff going through the systems there. So for my overall background, stuff like that, I've launched well over 100 brands in China, all through the different social media and e-commerce platforms there.
Well, that's terrific. And I know we're going to be following up on your China-specific insights, Ron. But before we do that, I think, we've had the benefit of having a robust exchange with Brian as a level-setting exercise. So I'm going to start off by throwing a question out to the group. And Jennifer, I'll start with you and we'll go in the same order. Just given that you've done work on CBD globally, like what are your high-level perspectives of the global CBD industry?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll just set the stage. What we're finding is it's still a decentralized industry. It's still very fragmented, and we don't yet have a unified voice globally on where do we think the industry is going. And Brian referenced this earlier, and Geoff having developed an association, I think, is very important. What we're noticing is that they're still small businesses, just like pre-cannabis legalization in Canada, and the corporates are starting to move in now very slowly, trying to understand what parts of the value chain they should be a part of. Should it be around the genetics and the seed breeding, or should it be around production? So it's not clear yet whether we're going to get a vertically integrated market like in Canada, or if it's going to be a let's call it pieces of the value chain, which we're seeing around the world. Capital continues to be a challenge. You would know this very well, Vivien. The markets are looking, there's a lot of dry powder, what they call dry powder in the market for investment, but they're very carefully looking at the sector saying a few things. Do we have professional management? Number one decision point for a company. You can have the greatest business, but if they don't trust management, you got a problem. Second is there IP that's attached to the value chain? IP, like in cannabis, has always been a key differentiator. And then most importantly, where do they have positions in the market and where do they sit? So in Canada, as an example, if you have a license to produce, if you have a good relationship with the government, those are all considered, quote, assets. Because this is an industry that is still professionalizing. And I when we had our prep call, I was citing this whole discussion around trust. I don't think that the industry yet has gained the trust of the governments, and there's work to be done. So it's very much in its early stage. If I think about when Deloitte stepped in, almost 6-7 years ago, we actually brought, like Cowen, a lot of legitimacy to the industry, but we had to be very careful because there was a lot of, let's call it, dark money in the sector. And so we had to help professionalize to bring the rigor to the table. And I think that has helped, but we need more of that in the industry.
That's terrific. Geoff, I mean, so you're touching CBD across or over the course of your career. You've touched CBD in multiple geographies. What are your perspectives? Are you noticing anything different as you kind of pivot to a U.S. focus? You know, you had some exposure to Canada too. What are you observing globally?
Well, as Jennifer certainly said, there is a diverse foundation for CBD around the world, and certainly we need to kind of figure out what that is going to be globally. Brian talked about that earlier. Certainly we at the National Hemp Association are working with the UN and all of our sister international organizations in creating an international foundation so that we can speak with one voice. There are so many different regulations, not only across the United States, but in Canada. Believe it or not, CBD was legal in the United States before it was legal in Canada versus medical marijuana or recreational marijuana, which obviously states have in the United States. So trying to play within those dynamics is a little bit challenging and difficult. Certainly, I started this by trying to help Paige Figge and Charlotte in trying to provide access to this extract, which originally was thought to be and proposed to be a marijuana extract, but in fact it was hemp at the end of the day. So their stories are very prominent. They certainly are in my everyday thoughts as we move forward. However, the challenges that we are seeing domestically in the United States are making it very difficult for this legitimate corporate industry to emerge. And we haven't got that trust that Jennifer talked about amongst corporate entities and government. I think there's been so many bankruptcies in our industry here domestically that even those who have led the fight in Congress are saying, was this a good move? So we need to rebuild that trust.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Ron, your area of expertise, is really concentrated in China. So I'd love to get your perspective on how you think about the Chinese CBD market in this global context.
Yeah, great. Yeah, on this whole, as you mentioned there, the CBD on the global aspect, right? So it is, as Brian mentioned before, it is in the early stages within the marketplace. Just the Chinese characters alone, when people first see what the ingredient level is, first thing they think is maybe it's maybe a controlled substance or something that's not legal to actually have in their product. So there's also a huge education aspect that needs to go on there. And as Brian mentioned, using the digital technologies and also the speed that China gets messaging out into the marketplace through these we call live stream commerce or social commerce type of personnel, whether it's Austin Lee or some of the other ones on Alibaba or some of these other platforms. The speed they can get messaging and product into the market is by far the fastest in the world and most productive in the world. So as this gets a little bit more mainstream or a little bit be able to access the market a little bit, the ability to scale that on a very, very rapid basis is going to be phenomenal. You'll never seen anything like this in the West. It's taken a long time to, because everyone's trying to do their own type of thing. But when you have, on a, for example, Alibaba platform, and you have 600 million people having access to this all within a very, very short time, the speed to adoption will be very, very quick.
Got it. That makes sense. Brian, any observations hearing these insights?
Right now, I'm trying to gather some threads right now, but I think this is really a good perspective where we're gathering a U.S. perspective, a Canadian perspective, and then tying it together a China perspective. With coming from before when I was at Arcview Group, my role is actually was really looking at the international markets where emerging opportunities and regulations really met hand in hand with each other, and that represented or was a telltale sign that something might be emerging. And so the problem with that is that everything is happening in a very geographically piecemeal fashion. Like, before maybe 2-3 years ago, we were starting to look at South America and most specifically Colombia as an emerging opportunity. And now some of the Colombian operators have, I think, so like Cleverly's Chiron, they've become more established, and international distribution deals are starting to happen. And so I think it's really interesting to think about now moving from cannabis 1.0 or hemp 1.0, where it's predominantly focused on North America, to a 2.0 generation where we're talking about international trade, supply chains that are processing where it should be, cultivation where it should be. But obviously this really only applies to hemps. With anything with cannabis, there will be geographical problems or more geographical problems. So it's interesting to think about that from a multi-jurisdictional perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And that actually dovetails really nicely into the next question. While there are clearly jurisdictional issues when it comes to CBD, that doesn't really seem to be as much the case for industrial hemp. And Geoff, I'm going to start with you. Given your role in the U.S. Hemp industry, how do you think about the prospects for industrial hemp?
Well, I think one of the things that we need to do is be able to address the issues that are really important to farmers in America. I mean, if we are going to develop this as the legislation passed by Congress declared hemp to be a commodity crop, we need to count on American farmers. However, there is no equipment that can harvest a crop that has the potential of growing 21 feet tall. There are no processors that can take that hemp into a facility to break it apart. It's unique and specialized IP. And then the question is who are those secondary sponsors? Who are the other consumers that are going to use that? Obviously, the automotive industry is a big target. However, they are going to need to know that supply chain is there before they'll even undertake a pilot program. We at Collective Growth, I certainly, through my experience, realize that is our biggest challenge. So I hope that we at Collective Growth will be the beginning to bring what I've said in many of my presentations, the scrambled egg, onto a plate so that we can have that entire supply chain. We have, as Jennifer talked about, corporate partnerships. We have started to develop partnerships with companies that are global, like New Holland, that is part of CNH Industrial. They obviously see that this is an opportunity for them to use hemp products in the tractors and equipment that they manufacture, but they also can be the manufacturer of the solutions for harvesting and decortication. Those discussions are going on. They're looking for IP. that they can bring to the marketplace. And if you are not aware, but I'm sure many of the people in the audience are aware, that CNH Industrial is part of the Exor Group, which owns Fiat Chrysler. So if we can really kind of bring that whole package together, we have a supply chain right there, a supply chain that is very eager to incorporate hemp into their product line. And I see that across the all sectors.
Jennifer, I see you nodding your head up and down. I'd love to turn it to you and have you expand on your thoughts, please. Thank you.
Yeah, I think Geoff brings up some great points. I think there's a whole industrial angle where there's a lot of reinvention and innovation happening where hemp can play a big role. So I completely agree with Geoff. I think that what I worry about with the industry is this concept around resilient leadership. So I've been leading the COVID response for Deloitte globally for our clients. And what's interesting about COVID, it's really raised question marks around resilient organizations. So this discussion around whether the hemp farmers and the supply chain will be around in 5-10 years is really going to depend on whether they lay the groundwork to be resilient. So what does that mean? It means, well, you need to have the trust of management. I mentioned this earlier. The second is that they need to be able to build resilient supply chains with trusted partners. And this word trust is not a word that comes up very often, but in all the research I've done around the world, speaking to CEOs, as we were formulating our COVID response as a firm, trust and resiliency became the number one topic. So I believe it has to come into this industry because if we don't behave in a professional way, if we don't have the rigor, if we don't have the standards, the professionalization, it's very, very hard to build resiliency amongst suppliers, the farmers, bring capital into the market, which is ultimately what the industry needs. And when you look at valuations of companies and when they IPO, one of the most important drivers of raising capital is how trusted the brand is and how trusted management is. And you would know this, Vivien, having done so many transactions. This industry has to understand that framework as they try and build resiliency. So I want to throw that out there because and then we break it into the consumer side, and I'll talk about industrial in a second. Being usage-based, usage and occasion-based is absolutely critical for this industry to understand what are the consumer needs that CBD could fulfill. How are they going to compete in the market? Is it an additive? Everything that we talked about earlier, Brian mentioned, because I truly believe that the usage occasions are actually quite global. I served a global client and we did segmentation around the world only to discover that there's really 6 major usage occasions. So that will allow this industry to start to get scale because you don't have to cover every niche. So I think that consumer centricity is going to be important. The second area is around data. How do we help this become a data-driven industry? It has I encourage this in cannabis in Canada too. It's very challenging to market. So how do we use data to help drive the efficiency and do things differently? And then the 4 dimensions of trust, which is very important. How does the industry demonstrate physical safety in this COVID environment, emotional and psychological safety for the farmers, the manufacturers, along the supply chain? How do we protect our people? The third is around financial safety. How do we make sure that they're starting to get capital into the market? And most important, digital safety. Ron talked earlier about e-commerce in China. The biggest challenge around the world on digital is this feeling that my data is protected. So none of these concepts of safety are immune. The hemp industry or the CBD industry isn't immune to these. And they have to understand that this is how the consumer is expecting them to behave.
Yeah, absolutely. All very good points. Ron, since Jennifer just gave you the call out on your comment, I would think both on the data side and on the trust side, you probably have some unique insights given your focus on e-commerce in China. So any thoughts there?
Absolutely. And just building on Jennifer's point there on trust, which she mentioned, I don't know how many different times within your short segment there, which is fantastic. So Chinese consumers, especially when they're buying overseas brands or foreign brands, number one is always trust from the brand. And the other two is authenticity. So looking back through the supply chain, is this a product that actually came from the actual brand or from the home country into China, stuff like that. So the two things that consumers always look for is authenticity and trust from the brand. Can they trust that you're actually putting the real ingredients in there? Is this an authentic product directly from you? So those are the two things that are really key drivers in China e-commerce, especially for foreign brands. So as we get in, as Brian mentioned, a lot of the topical stuff you can actually start getting into China, step by step to get in here. For the brands, they really need to think about those two key factors in order to get the next segment. So if you have one of the top live streamers, they're not going to actually probably take one of your products on to help build your brand without knowing a little bit more about yourself, knowing about your growing aspects, your supply chain, make sure you're a trusted brand, you're well received in your home market before you can actually get into China. So it's very, very important for those two key factors, trust and authenticity of your product.
Yeah, that makes good sense. So Brian, I'd love to hear your perspective then on trust and transparency of product with the consumer. What are you seeing the industry, very nascent of course, doing today, and or what would you hope to see the industry start doing going forward to really reinforce that trust with consumers as this category emerges?
Yeah, I think this is especially important in China as we tie it because of the fact that there is when we talk about CBD coming from China, there's always this, the elephant in the room is that the quality of the products that we're talking about here. We're talking about, heavy metal contamination. We're talking about different types of contaminants that is often associated with, with that idea. And so, that's super important when we talk about, everything, on the supply chain for cultivation. It starts with cultivation. It really starts with cultivation, looking at the soil, doing soil testing on the land that the crop is planted on, and then going all the way down to producing the ingredients and then going down to the product. And so, that concept is probably not something that Chinese consumers are thinking about today. When they hear about a CBD products being produced in China, the first thing they'll think of is no one is telling them that the plant has an incredible ability to absorb contaminants from the soil, and no one's telling them that the product they're consuming, depending on who made it, might not be trustworthy and actually could be very damaging to their body. Since the history, again, to what Ron was saying as well, it's really the intensity and acceleration of adoption in China could very much just skip over that entire part of the learning curve that happened in the United States. So it's incredibly important for, that, and again, this, goes back to the type of companies that are really operating in the space and given the privilege to operate is to really focus on that and understand that there's aspect of consumer safety, trust, that they're giving you more than other consumer products that you need to be really be wary of. And that's not just for the domestic market, but also maintaining that, that integrity of the supply chain for global customers as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you could certainly, sorry, Jennifer, you're going to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think the Chinese consumer is also a very unique consumer in that brand building, which we've been talking about, is not a national exercise. If you look to luxury brands around the world where I've done work, they strategically place themselves around the world to build brand because the Asian consumer travels. A lot of international tourism, and that is where they build brand to come back to China to buy from overseas. So understanding that path to purchase is also very important. You could spend a significant amount of time building brand in China when really maybe the opportunity is overseas. And it sounds counterintuitive, but has proved out for a number of brands to be highly effective. I love Brian's view and Ron's view on that, but my experience, they have to be a global brand to be a credible brand.
Well, I can certainly tell you, my experience in global beauty would absolutely reinforce that. I mean, if you look at Estee Lauder's business, travel retail is over 20% of their sales. Yep. And they developed this cachet around brands like La Mer, Estee Lauder, and Clinique in that travel retail channel, and then ultimately launched in China. But even when they decided to launch in China, I can never forget this anecdote. They advertised for the Estee Lauder brand in China for 6 years before they launched it, because that also helped create that awareness with those global travelers.
Yeah, the fastest growing retail are airports around the world because airports have transitioned themselves into a luxury location. So thinking very, very differently and looking at the other retail trends happening around the world, I think is critical for this industry also.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, sure. Jennifer, I'm glad you made mention of that as well too. So like I said, I've worked with a lot of, hundreds of brands, getting them into China, and the mentality is that they need to come to China to actually be in China. And I preach, and I've been preaching, I've been doing what I can to get people in our brands we work with is to actually activate your brand, right? Could be 6, 9, 12 months before you even think about coming to China. Create a demand for that brand before you even come, because that's when you have, whether it's the global travelers or you have the duty-free shops, stuff like that, you're able to get in those. But in your home market, you'll be able to connect with the local Chinese in those, whether it's travel or the other we call influencers that are in, especially on the US side or Australia side. They have overseas buying networks. You need to be in those channels. Activate your brand long before you come to China, where you can create a demand that when you actually do launch in China, you can actually have a chance for success.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. I would think that, having some kind of product standards would go a long way in terms of building that trust. I think that's one of the problems that we have in the U.S. Geoff, I believe you've got a very important meeting in Washington, D.C. So I'd love to hear about that. And I'd love to hear your perspectives on the potential for a more formal regulatory framework in the U.S.
Yeah, so I've had the great pleasure of meeting with the FDA through the White House. Before the Farm Bill was passed, we had a meeting with all of their top directors, senior officials, to discuss hemp after the Farm Bill so that we could start to prepare the industry on the concerns that the FDA has. And those concerns are rightfully so. Certainly, I am seeing products that have been brought to our attention that, the origins of those products, no one really knows. I saw products that had the USDA logo for organic status on it before USDA could even touch the product. And remember, there are families out there that are using CBD instead of prescription medicine. So we should all be very concerned about it. The meeting that I've been invited to on the 17th next week, again by the White House and their Office of Management and Budget, to look at FDA regulatory discretion over CBD. It's one of these big challenging issues. And for those people that are tuning in today, this is probably the first time in the history of our nation that federal legislation was passed that allowed states to introduce research on a product and bring that product to market under that research with no federal oversight. And that's really what has happened with the 2014 Farm Bill. And so we have this immense amount of CBD in the market. CBD, although it is the number one product that's out there, it only represents 2% of the potential of the hemp product or the hemp crop. But it is out there because it's the easiest for people to produce. And obviously, Charlotte's Web and Charlotte Figge's story catapulted that to the forefront of everyone's discussion. But we need to work with the FDA to make sure that we have an absolute solid supply chain. And I'm hopeful that we can convince the White House that we need to have a program put in place that allows for some discretionary regulations by the FDA that will allow them to establish standards, give the industry 2 years to live up to those standards. And at the same time, I'm going to be asking for funding, as they've done for COVID-19 research, for funding to really advance what the FDA is desperate for, is that in America research on CBD and its potential. So we're really looking forward to it. It's an honor to go to represent the industry. We've got a lot of issues to discuss, but it's one way we're going to move this industry forward.
Yeah, that's so exciting. Best of luck next week.
Thanks so much.
What's that?
No, I said thank you.
Absolutely. Jennifer, contrasting, Geoff's overview of the U.S. regulatory landscape, but Canada has certainly taken a different view of CBD. So for the benefit of the audience, can you level set us on where the Canadians are on CBD, the regulators?
Sure. So cannabis and CBD-derived product fall under the cannabis regulations and have become federally legal. Industrial hemp, as a result, is permitted through viable seeds. You can sell grain. You can take the hemp seed derivative into cosmetics. So CBD is falling under the Cannabis Act. The big challenge right now is educating the population. So just to educate on Canada, we're federally legal. Health Canada oversees it, which is equivalent of the FDA. The government is the wholesale buyer of cannabis and CBD product, which then gets distributed through retail. You're seeing, though, the CBD derivatives show up in natural products and also on the natural food side. So there's a lot of confusion still amongst the consumers on what is CBD, what are the medicinal benefits, if at all, what are the big brands. So you're seeing the retailers starting to think about moving into the space heavily as they begin to what Brian described, turn them into more cosmetic and therapeutic products. Most likely, what I believe is that it's going to end up being a derivative in a consumer-based product. With the prices falling, what we talked about earlier, and biomass price falling, it's very hard just to be an end product. So I think what you're going to see in Canada is the continuation of the government allowing it to go through their cannabis channels, but you're also going to still see the proliferation within the natural food industry.
And is there, just to follow up on that, what about the outlook for expanding product availability into more traditional mass merchant retailers?
I think you're going to see the proliferation of it in the mass market retailers. They're very interested in the space. They see it as a pre-step before they move into any cannabis product, even though some of the retailers are. I think you're going to see the growth of the CPGs, like I mentioned earlier, moving into the space and creating as an additive. And you're going to see the rise of private label as a result. A lot of the retailers have private label. You've also seen a huge number of transactions in the space. I just did a count for a client today, and in the global hemp market, there was about 213 hemp transactions last year, and in the US, 132, of which the majority of the major transactions were Canadian cannabis companies. And so you're seeing that the Canadian cannabis world, they are incorporating hemp and CBD-based product into their portfolio. So that means you're going to start seeing it in their supply chains. Now, it's going to be a challenge because of the challenges everyone's going through with COVID, but I believe you're going to start seeing it where they're going to partner with retailers, be contract manufacturers, et cetera, because of the state of the pricing structure at the moment.
Yeah, I think we've seen certainly evidence of that in my coverage with Aurora's acquisition of Reliva. They're not just buying a CBD offering; they're buying route to market.
Absolutely.
Because Reliva had done such a good job penetrating convenience and gas, which is an under-penetrated market in the U.S. for CBD. Yeah.
Yeah, and you see Kronos had acquired Redwood for $283 million. Tilray has acquired Manitoba Harvest for $360 million. So you're seeing transactions. I think the big question goes back to viability. How viable and resilient will these LPs be over the long term, and how many will survive? You may end up like a beer structure in Canada, which you would know well. You have 3 or 4 major players, right? And then the rest goes through and ends up going through retail.
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
Wanted to tie that to the international level, and we're talking about oversight and regulatory movement at the FDA level, and also the real economic impact of all the on the CBD market and the cannabis market. Being informed, actually, one of our team members, many of the audience might know, is David Wenger, who's on the U.S. House and Senate Cannabis Working Group. When we look at the international level, in September, they'll be having an intersessional media, essentially, for the member countries to analyze and discuss what are the real economic, societal, political, regulatory, oversight, all these issues, so that they can really discuss what has happened and discuss their findings with each country. Okay, so this country has done this. What have you learned? So that they can prepare a package so that in December they can have a fix and understand a more fulsome understanding of what it will look like after legalization, if that was to happen.
Yeah. But Ron, a follow-up question for you then, really linking what Brian just said to Jennifer's earlier comment about the importance of viability. Given your role, obviously, I think you're probably seeing a lot of assets, and you have to be choiceful about your time and resources and what kind of brands you want to partner with and activating them in the Chinese market. So what are you looking for in terms of key characteristics around brands that you think help solve for both kind of viability and trust?
Yeah. Thanks for that as well too. So one of the biggest challenges in China is to take a brand from 0 to 1 in the consumer's mind, right? So Chinese consumers, they do not buy products, they only buy brands. So we have to really lean back into what your brand means. And we, as Jennifer mentioned before, is having this brand activation overseas and actually to get you to the next level. So when you only lead with your product or an ingredient, there's only a certain amount of market penetration you can probably get with that. Even doesn't matter how much money you spend, stuff like that, unless you're working, again, if you work with one of the big live streamers that can help push that out there. But again, without having a brand to back it up and the trust and viability and authenticity, that whole supply chain you're looking at, it's going to be very challenging to get ahead. So you look at a lot of for example, the U.S. Topical or beauty companies in this space, in the CBD space, all of them are brand new to the marketplace to some degree. They're very unknown in China. So it's going to take some time in order to build that up. I think even in the U.S. side of things, that there's so many brands that have come out recently, especially most of them are all D2C brands, that number one, which is good because they are very digitally focused on what they're doing, right? They know the consumers, they look at data, and we do the same thing with China as well too. So when we look at bringing brands to China, that's the first thing we looked at. What is their brand equity in China at this time, right? We have to take them from 0 to 1, which is the hardest part, and then you can start scaling from there. So, but with this new category, CBD skincare, CBD beauty, if it moves into ingestibles later on, which it sometime probably will, it could take a little bit of time to get there, but it could be accelerated depending on the movement, not only from regulatories on China's side, but also the acceptance from some of the larger influencers to help mainstream those in a very, very short time.
That's helpful. Geoff, given your experience in the industry, I'd love your perspectives on brands too. I mean, under Bruce, Canopy started developing a portfolio of CBD brands, and certainly under David Klein, they've continued that, and we're waiting for the launch of the Martha Stewart CBD line, later this year. So I'd love to get your perspective on how you think about brand development in the U.S. and any perspective that Bruce might have shared with you too. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. I think, first of all, if you look at the quarterly results that just came out of Canopy, look at the revenue increase that the Works experienced. This was an acquisition that was made under Bruce. It's a cosmetic company out of Great Britain. Their revenue increased dramatically. And I think that that's what you're going to start to see because the Works is a very trusted brand in Great Britain and in Europe. I do think that those of us that are in this industry have to continue to build the trust around the brands. There are some that are out there right now that are household names, but they have also been subject to the FDA sending out warning letters. So that trust has been somewhat broken. So again, the discussion around trust, on our pre-call, Jennifer raised it. I probably raised it 30 times with my colleagues at Collective Growth since then. It is something that we need to do both in the National Hemp Association as well as Collective Growth, is that we need to bring these partners together so we have trust across the country. Most people will not know that the China-America trade agreement, not sure if that's actually going to be put into effect, but there is language in there that requires that China buys American hemp. So, we need to be able to deliver that. That supply chain is not there. It's more industrial than it is CBD. So those are the sorts of things that we need to put in place. And as you talk about the international market, I had the pleasure of participating in the UN General Assembly last year. I was asked if I would host a breakfast for a couple agricultural types. I had 28 leaders of agriculture from around the world attend that meeting. And they were people who were really interested in what America was doing in the hemp space. And what I've realized, Jennifer, no offense to my fellow Canadians, but it seems that the world kind of looks at, if it's not done in the United States, it's not real. And now that it's real here, the entire world is focusing on what the United States is doing. And we need to build that trust amongst the brands so that the global world will look at hemp as being something that will be part of their day-to-day life.
I'll add to that because I think it's actually, you bring up a very good point. Canada, being the size of market it is only a stepping stone into the US. And that'd be my perspective. It's where you go to learn professionalization, you learn the whole value chain, and then you can enter into the US. So I totally agree with you, Geoff.
Yeah, it's how I actually sold, hemp to Senator Schumer. I was told he wasn't going to be interested in it. That wasn't something he was going to lead. He was going to require that his caucus kind of bring it forward. But when we had the discussion of the fact that, $600 million worth of hemp grain is produced in Canada, and a lot of that ends up on the shelves of Whole Foods and others in New York. And the simple question was, don't you think American farmers should have that opportunity? And now Senator Schumer wants to be known as Senator Hemp. He, invented this crop. So, it's really important.
That's terrific perspective. Thanks to all of our panelists. I believe it is now time to get John back into the conversation, and he's going to moderate some Q&A for us.
Amazing. What a great discussion. This covered a lot of ground, so I appreciate you, Vivien, and all the panelists for such a well-informed, thoughtful discussion. A lot of good questions. So I'll just kind of take them from the top. Talking about the, if it doesn't happen in the U.S., it hasn't really happened yet. With the passing of the Farm Bill and the regulations. This question is for Geoff and then also for Brian. I'd like for you to weigh in on what the consequences are of the UN General Assembly meeting in December and what it could mean for the growth of the global hemp industry, as well as, in particular, the Chinese hemp industry, if there was to be a rescheduling or descheduling based on the World Health Organization's recommendation when the UN Single Commission is discussed in December. So, Geoff, I'll kick it to you to start.
Yeah, this is an issue that we've been discussing for years. As we actually developed the language for the 2018 Farm Bill, there were those that wanted to push the CBD limit to way beyond the 0.3%, which we know is a number that somebody came up with, and we don't really understand why. But one of the things we discussed was that it would be incorrect of us to put that into federal language if we wanted to build a global market for American farmers and industry, because there are diverse numbers and regulations around the world. And if we decided to exceed it, we would not be helping the industry here. However, it is one of the reasons why the National Hemp Association has joined with our Canadian colleagues, the Canadian Hemp Trade Alliance, and the European Hemp Association to try to create an international association so that we can start to address the UN Single Treaty, the World Health Organization, and what's happening in the EU. I think that is the natural evolution of this. Yes, we have some housekeeping to do at home, a lot of housekeeping to do, but at the same time, we need to start to address that international standards so that we do have a level playing field that everyone can work under.
Yeah, definitely echo Geoff's sentiments. And I actually think that the passing of this is less about America and China, but about everyone else all over the world. That, America is already federally legal, and that the plant is, being cultivated all around the country. In China as well, the plant has been cultivated for industrial purposes, grains, etc., and now being converted into CBD. But it's really everyone else, all the other countries around the world, that is trying to follow and understanding that hemp as a multifaceted crop for many different usages. That a vote to reschedule cannabis or change the status of CBD can really accelerate the adoption of other countries that might want to get into hemp.
Maybe this is a question just to follow up on that for all the panelists to weigh in on, but do we see the potential for the industry to develop more along the pharmaceutical track or more along an open nutraceutical track? And then what would that mean for the industry in the US as well as in China? I mean, we see like the EU novel foods, the regulations recently in the UK. And then, how does that filter through to what we might see as far as the competitiveness of the Chinese hemp industry and to supply the globe. So maybe, Brian, I'll kick it to you, and then I'd love to hear everyone's perspective.
I think this is very much will depend on looking at the U.S., looking at what the FDA as well as the European regulations rule. I think in this way, China might be the only one that might be slightly different and have their own perspective on this. But I think the whole world will most likely follow what the FDA and the EU has to say about this.
Yep. Anybody else care to weigh in?
Yeah. So, John, it is part of our presentation to the White House. Certainly, there has been precedents established by the FDA that we would ask them to look at. Something as simple as Motrin. Most people may not remember that Motrin was a pharmaceutical grade prescription-only drug, but it's now an over-the-counter, and it is so because they reduce the amount of milligrams that are in the product. And if you look at some, prescription grade vitamins and others, we have both paths of it being over the counter, dietary supplement, or certainly by prescription, pharmaceutical grade. That is the path that we are going to encourage the FDA to look at, but they need some help from Congress to be able to have the authority to do so. So that is one of the paths that we're taking right now. And certainly, I think it will all come down to the amount of milligrams of CBD that's going to be in products.
I don't think it's one or the other either. I think that both tracks and both industries could treat the product very differently. And going down the pharma route gives it legitimacy. There's pluses and minuses. But if we talk about trust, whether we like it or not, pharma does have rigorous processes and standards and resources for scientific research. And scientific research is actually a very, very important pillar for this industry to demonstrate that there's rigor. So it's not a bad thing. And it may just you might end up with two tracks of nutraceutical and pharmaceutical adopting this, which actually would be great given there's an oversupply in the market right now. So it's not as if, it's a scarce resource.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, and certainly from an FDA perspective, John, they only know CBD because of what GW Pharmaceutical has done. They've gone through a clinical trial, they've presented the data, and that's how the FDA works. I mean, that's their responsibility. And so they only see CBD as a pharmaceutical grade drug because that's what they have been presented. So it being a dietary supplement, not on their radar. But they have certainly been focusing on this because when we went to see them, they knew that there was CBD in the plant material, even in the casings on the seed. So, they've done their homework.
Well, let's just keep it on CBD as an ingredient and, being able to develop that. I've had a couple questions about, will it be more economical to cultivate CBD from cannabis as opposed to what's defined as industrial hemp? And then that brings in the question of synthetics. And we're starting to see advancements in labs, the development of not just synthetic CBD, but also CBN, CBG, and other secondary cannabinoids. And so what effects do we see that having on the market in the near term, both in the US, China, and internationally?
I can certainly start off with that one. I would say that, given the deflation that we've seen in the U.S. hemp market, that seems like kind of the obvious source of supply. Like the pricing in the cannabis market has remained generally pretty healthy. There was some deflation about 1.5 years, 2 years ago, largely driven by Oregon. But as we're seeing more and more adult use in medical states come online, and at least in the United States, given the inability to have interstate commerce, individual state pricing has remained quite elevated. So I would think from a gross margin perspective, leveraging the oversupply of hemp would make sense. Certainly there is progress being made in terms of synthetics. Kronos, which is under my coverage, has a deal with Ginkgo Bioworks to look at a number of different cannabinoids. That seems like it's still relatively early days.
Okay.
Yeah, and John, from our perspective at Collective Growth, hemp is hemp is hemp. Yes, there are these cultivars that people are growing, in plastic like Christmas trees to get, high percentages of CBD. but all hemp has CBD in it. So if we are able to really find the solutions of the supply chain to build a commodity crop, if we're planting 100,000 acres of a commodity crop, that all that leaf material will provide CBD. So it will certainly allow the prices to drop. But I am also a believer, and I know some states like New York and others are looking at their permitting to address kind of 5 categories. Production that will benefit everyone. So small production for the supply to their medical marijuana program, smaller productions that will go into isolates, larger productions, more field crops that would go into consumer goods. I think that's the way that we're going to make sure that it's a level playing field, that everyone can benefit from this crop, and certainly figure out how to make most uses of it.
I think at the end of the day, this is going to be a commodity, right? If we had to call a spade, unless there's differentiation or IP built into a particular strain. And so I think that, whether it's synthetics actually allow for manage cost much differently, allows for innovation. And the challenge with growing is the consistency of the seed and the genetics and the output, right? So you may find over the long term that synthetics will win just because it's able to bring consistency to the market. So if you want to grow it naturally, they're going to have to bring a lot more rigor to the process in order for it to be consistent, or you're going to end up in a synthetic world.
Yeah, I agree.
I totally agree with that. Looking at it from either the API perspective or the nutraceutical, it's very commoditized. And I think, if you're looking at the biosynthetic versus the natural planting route, they could be used for very different purposes. From a pharmaceutical application perspective, where you're asking for consistency and you could have the room for much higher margins than asking for the same consistent rare cannabinoids. I'm not talking about just CBD, but all the different rare cannabinoids that would be much harder to, as of current environment, much harder to identify, cultivate, grow for those rare cannabinoids. Then biosynthetics would probably make much more sense. Versus if you're talking about CBD or some of the easier or more prevalent cannabinoids, then even looking at just where China might be in 24 36 months, it's very, very much commoditized, even lower than what we can, much lower than what you can possibly imagine what CBD can go down to. So I would say that the biosynthetic route definitely has its very powerful uses, but they're not the same as just a simple commoditized ingredient.
Yeah.
Okay, so we talked about cannabinoids as an ingredient, but also industrial hemp factors into this conversation, and there's a perception that China is well ahead. I think has over 50% of the patents on industrial hemp globally originate from China. But then I think there's a perception or an awareness in the marketplace that there's a dearth of genetics for high CBD and cosmetic cannabinoid strains in China. And so I think if one country has a lot of IP around industrial hemp, another has a lot of IP surrounding the cannabinoids, perhaps there's an opportunity for collaboration. Geoff, you hinted at that, right, with the trade bill and this sale and purchase between the purchase of hemp from the U.S. for China. And so, does this create an opportunity for collaboration? And I'll kick it to you first, Brian. What opportunities are you seeing as far as industrial hemp IP from China to the U.S. and then going the other way, genetics coming into China?
Actually, I would defer this one to Geoff. I think my viewpoint on it is just the most simplistic. Is just the collaboration on whatever each country lacks. So I would love to hear actually Geoff's opinion on this.
Yeah, and thanks, Brian. I think that this is, most people in our industry think that we are the biggest industry in America or around the globe right now, where in reality we're not even a blip on anybody's radar. So that's why collaboration is going to be absolutely important and crucial. We all know what the potential is, but how we get there is going to be very, very challenging. So I certainly know that China has obviously had this crop, like France. in existence for many years, but they are very regional success stories. And if we are going to make a global commodity of this, we all need to work together. And I'm hopeful that we as associations can somewhat get beyond the geopolitical issues that are out there right now and try to find ways that we can all work together. The other thing that I have found in traveling the globe on this topic is that people are very protective of their information. And I think that we need to find a way for people to be more comfortable in sharing that information and looking at forming collaborations. And as Jennifer has said, doing it on a corporate level, on a professional level, rather than what this industry has really been doing is like, well, let's just kind of talk on the side and figure out how to, make this happen. We need to make this a professional, international, global commodity, and it's going to take an awful lot of work to get us there.
I mean, I think that's a great sentiment, Geoff, and it's really almost a great sentiment to end on. Is further collaboration and cooperation between U.S. and China, and certainly globally, all countries that have a stake in this this burgeoning industry. An additional collaboration is much needed, much desired for all of our benefit, and not just on the cannabinoid side of the equation, but also on the industrial hemp side of the equation. Insofar as we look at textiles, building materials, and all of the multitude of ways that we can utilize hemp. So I think that, with just a few minutes left, I'd like to just ask all of our panelists if you have any closing thoughts, anything that you'd want to leave our audience with. And then we will, and before I do that, I want to thank all of our panelists and our moderators, and even Gerald listening in the background for his contribution earlier in the discussion with Brian. And so thank you so much for being a part of the webinar. And let's just round robin our closing thoughts. Vivien, would you like to begin?
Sure, happy to. I would say, for me and Gerald, we would acknowledge, I think that, the CBD industry in the U.S. Has not yet met our expectations in terms of market development, but we are hopeful that more regulatory clarity will help remedy that.
Mm-hmm. Jennifer?
I think that this discussion around trust and resiliency, for me, would be a key takeaway. I think the industry needs to study what that's going to mean for the hemp industry and what professionalization will look like. You are the company that you keep, right? So we saw that in Canada now the founders have moved on and they're bringing much more professional corporate views to the table. So that rigor, I think the hemp industry can learn from. In the Canadian industry, really, we lived it, and there's a lot of lessons to be learned around the world.
Yeah, thank you. Ron?
I just want to reiterate around the brand, trust, authenticity, and we didn't mention this a little bit earlier, is that, make sure your trademarks registered in China before you want to actually show up and do any business there. So that's my key takeaway for everybody.
That's a great key takeaway, Ron. Certainly. It's almost worth saying twice. So Geoff, final words.
Yeah, so I would be remiss in my responsibility as chair of the National Hemp Association to let those who are listening in, viewing this, let them know that the National Hemp Association based in Washington, we're there to help. We certainly have a very great website, so we would encourage you to check us out. I'd also like to thank Arcview because it was at our meeting in late fall last year, John, where Bruce and I kind of ran into each other and decided that, we needed to take on the hemp industry. So the germination of what is now Collective Growth started there. So kudos to Arcview for once again being at the forefront of building a new company.
Yeah, that's the value of Arcview, right? It's
absolutely
serendipitous meetings that you can only get in the room or on the Zoom, as the case may be. So, Brian, we'll kick it to you for the final word before I hand the co-hosting duties back to Kim to bring us home.
Yeah, I like to echo, Geoff and Jen's comment about trust and collaboration. And this is not just related to hemp. I think a comment I really liked earlier, is really about the fact that the whole world is working around the hemp plan and towards one direction, is that we're working together to commercialize, to professionalize, and build the industry together. And that's very important in the environment we are today, where we're seeing global divisions for geopolitical reasons, for all kinds of trade tensions. And I think it's very, we can all learn a lot from taking what we're doing here today and looking at the hemp and cannabis industry from Canada, US, international, and beyond, and what that means. And especially as for Asia Horizon, we're concentrated on the industry in China, and that we try to learn more from each other and see this as an opportunity to collaborate, despite all the divisive forces that we're seeing in this farm today.
Thank you, Brian. Kim?
Wow, what a great panel, you guys. I am just absolutely thrilled and so appreciative. Absolutely. Trust, collaboration, and this idea of collision. So I think that was a really interesting point. I mean, a lot of us met at Arcview. We've had a chance to get to know each other and trust each other, and now building businesses together. And it's kind of the cornerstone of what Arcview's been about for years is, creating this opportunity for collision. And so kind of speaking about that and what we can do for you going forward. So if there are those of you who are not members of Arcview, we would love to have you in the family, get the chance to collide with someone in the industry. We're known for education. We're known for providing opportunities. And so we'd love to, like I said, have you in the fold. So visit arcviewaccess.com. You can see all the new things that we have coming up. We have an Explore series, we have a Discovery series. So we're really kind of looking at, some of the newer entrants into this market. So if you're looking to learn, we've got programs for you, and you can always reach out to sales@arcview.com. There's a survey that's coming up here. That's really important if you could fill that out for us. It helps us really identify those topical areas that are important for you, things that we can do better, things that we can deliver to you from an educational standpoint. Also, we love to just kind of get feedback on, the presenters here and anyone you want to connect with. We will make sure we do that as well. So you can also use that as part of your Q&A or the chat function and reach out to us either at sales@arcviewgroup.com or info@arcviewgroup.com. We'll get you connected to anybody. There's two things I want to talk about for the month of August that are coming up that are really, really cool. One of which is a tour. And we've been doing these tours of cannabis operators in different industry segments for the last couple of months. And I have to say, it is the coolest thing. My favorite so far was 1906, but I think Aqualitas, which is coming in on August 20th. And that's a tour behind the scenes of Aqualitas, which is an hydroponic grow facility in Nova Scotia. So just think, we're sitting behind our computers, looking at our screens. So why don't you come with me on a trip to Nova Scotia on August 20th? And I'm going to have Erica post in the chat there for you how to get tickets for that. And then we also have Global Hemp Day. So we're going to take this conversation. We're going to, up our game. We're going to now go beyond China too. We're going to do it globally. We're doing it with Canatech. Some of the people that you've seen on screen today will also be joining us for that event. That is August 26th. And so we look forward to seeing you there. But again, thanks everybody for this great panel, and see you again soon. Take care.